Welcome to the Schar School Power Lunch. This week, it's a roundtable on U.S.-East Asian relations. In a short period, U.S. foreign policy has moved from a pivot to Asia to trade wars and antagonism. In the region where globally consequential decisions are to be made, very little is now clear. What factors will determine American relations with China and U.S. allies in Japan, India, South Korea, and Taiwan? What are the politics of these relationships in the post-pandemic world? The Power Lunch welcomes Ambassador Max Baucus, former U.S. Ambassador to China and former Democratic U.S. Senator and Congressman from Montana. Shabani Mahtani, Hong Kong-based Southeast Asia Bureau Chief for The Washington Post. And H.R. McMaster, former National Security Advisor and the author of the new book, Battlegrounds: The Fight to Defend the Free World. Well, much of the world's geopolitical future hinges on one relationship, that of the United States and China. And as these two powers continue to feel each other out, their inconsistent relationship has kept East Asia on edge and altered the global landscape. Welcome to the Power Lunch. I'm Justin Guest, Associate Professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government. Today marks the final installment of our opening series, which began with the 2020 election and has taken us through to the week of Joe Biden's inauguration. Before I bring in our outstanding panel today, I'd like to welcome Mark Rozell, Dean of the Schar School, who would like to share some remarks.
Great. Dean Rozell. Thank you, Justin. Delighted to be here. Thank you for everything you've done in putting together this really excellent series. This is the final of 9 programs of the Power Lunch. And I just wanted to express my appreciation to you, Justin, for all you've done in putting these programs together, bringing some very fine panelists and contributing to the Schar School's mission of projecting what we know and what various communities understand about critical public policy issues that the country and the world are confronting these days. For those who don't know, the Schar School of Policy and Government is one of the 10 schools or colleges of George Mason University. We are located both in Arlington and in Fairfax, Virginia. And we have a variety of degree programs from bachelor's, master's, professional degree programs as well, and PhD programs. We have about 2,000 students in the Schar School, about 80 full-time faculty. And our faculty are comprised of not only traditional academics, but also a number of high-level practitioners, former directors of federal agencies, ambassadors, members of Congress, others. So for our professional school students, they have a lot of opportunity to intersect with the so-called real-world politics, which is what the Power Lunch also is all about. So again, thank you for all you've done in putting together this outstanding series. And one of the things I like best about it is I get to sit back and listen and learn. So Justin, take it from here.
Thanks so much, Mark. And of course, it's been a labor of love. And I think on behalf of the entire team that produces the series, it's been our pleasure. And today we have nothing less than a top-class panel. Let me introduce Ambassador and Senator Max Baucus, who's joining us from Montana, Shabani Mahtani, who's joining us from Hong Kong, and General H.R. McMaster, who joins us from Palo Alto, California. Thank you so much for joining us. So much of how one views the next 4 years of U.S.-Chinese relations hinges on how one views the previous 40 years. And so before we discuss the prospects for the future, I wanted to ask each panelist to characterize where the last few decades of U.S. foreign policy have brought us. Shabani, from your perch on Hong Kong Island, where do things between the U.S. and China stand as Joe Biden prepares to take office?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I'm very honored to be joining such an esteemed panel today. I think this is a really remarkable time to be discussing this after, really stunning events in Washington that I think have captured the attention of the whole world. If anything, I think the past week has sort of cemented in the minds of many this idea that the U.S., the West in general, is a power in decline. And the reality of that for the region is that there's never been a more assertive and a more powerful Beijing. I think that, you've seen Beijing's rhetoric in the past week that has, just been gleeful at the scenes from the capital. And at the same time, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's trip across Southeast Asia, they see this as a huge opportunity to push on their agenda, to continue, a policy of repression and fear in Hong Kong, and to continue sort of asserting itself more broadly around the region. And I think the region is now hungry to see what the U.S. under Biden can do and how it can challenge this threat.
Well, General McMaster, in your new book, which of course was written before the insurrection at the Capitol, you write that Chinese leaders are already perceiving a narrow opportunity to pursue their national interest and shape the international order before China's vulnerabilities are exposed and the rest of the world realizes that they're being exploited by them. You write, and let me just quote it, "The Communist Party has no intention of playing by the rules associated with international law, trade, or commerce. China's overall strategy relies on co-option and coercion at home and abroad, and as well on concealing the nature of China's true intentions. And on balance, you say, the Chinese Communist Party's goals run counter to American ideals and American interests," unquote. Is the right conclusion then that we should be drawing is that there is just very little space for peaceful coexistence between these two countries? And if coexistence is possible, what are the conditions?
Well, I mean, coexistence is already happening, right? So I think there are some fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of the challenge to the free world from the Chinese Communist Party, and that are worth just addressing quickly at the outset. And the first of these, and it's really kind of even how the session's framed, and this is understandable because I think it's the predominant interpretation of the competition, is that this is really a competition between Washington and Beijing, right? But I think what you've seen with Chinese Communist Party actions, really, since just the pandemic, is that this is a free world China problem, right? China foisted the pandemic on the world. It repressed any kind of news of human-to-human transmission. It punished the doctors and the journalists who were trying to ring the alarm bells about the pandemic. It added insult to injury with its wolf warrior diplomacy. Since the pandemic, it's bludgeoned Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier, rammed vessels in the South China Sea, it extended the repressive arm of the party into Hong Kong, where Shabani's done tremendous reporting and just in recent days, right, the arrest of 53 young rights activists in Hong Kong. And we've seen the extension of concentration camps in Xinjiang and Xi Jinping boasting, hey, I'm going to put some additions on those because people really like to be re-educated, the forced labor. And so I mean, it could go on about this, right? So, hey, tell me again, how this is a Washington Beijing problem? No, it's a free world Chinese Communist Party problem. And I think the second is that there hasn't been multinational cooperation, and I think there has been a high degree of it. I think that there's a greater recognition of the threat to free and open societies. And then finally, Justin, what you're alluding to is that this idea of a Thucydides trap, right? That we face this dilemma of either complete accommodation of the Chinese Communist Party or a disastrous war. And that is a false dilemma, and there's plenty of space to compete. And so the argument that I make in Battlegrounds, and I think the rational argument to make, is that we have to compete effectively to protect us against what is now, I think clearly the intentions of the party to export its authoritarian mercantilist model externally. And as Shabani has said, they're going to take full advantage, right, of the perception of U.S. weakness and division associated with the assault on the Capitol as the latest indication to them that they're winning. But then also the party's in a race as well internally, right, to extend and tighten its exclusive grip on power, to stifle human freedom, to build the firewall higher and higher. And this is, as you alluded to at the beginning, because they believe they have this fleeting window of opportunity to take advantage, right, of their relative advantages over us, and to accomplish their objectives internationally and internally.
And we'll be coming to those internal politics shortly. But before we do, I want to bring Senator Baucus in here. You know, in a recent interview with CNBC, Senator Baucus, you said that, quote, even though we see a lot of top-line political rhetoric going back and forth, referring to that relationship between Washington and Beijing, of course, I think that the relationship is a bit more sound than meets the eye, you said. It's a complementary economic relationship. The Chinese want our soybeans for their hog farmers. They want our semiconductors to manufacture in China. And we Americans want to be able to sell our soybeans to the hog producers in China. We want to sell our semiconductors, you said. Are these economic interdependencies enough to outweigh what General McMaster portrays as fundamentally opposed national interests?
I think they're important, probably more important than most people realize, because we see so much in the newspapers that's political back and forth. And most business men and women are not politicians. Most businessmen and women don't like to see their names in the newspapers, but they like signing contracts, like building up their bottom line. I think it's extremely important. However, we are clearly, this is almost trite, a profound tectonic plate shift. China is rising. Not too many years from now, its GDP will be larger than that of the US. China is in Asia, about 5 billion people. China and Asia, US and Western countries, only about 1.7 billion. The plates are shifting, and there's not much we can do about that. We have to recognize that. We have to deal with that. And I think, though, and we have to realize as Americans, we can't control the world as much as we have in the past, since Bretton Woods, as much as we like to, because the realities of the world have changed so much. I think the bottom line here, frankly, is that the United States first has to get its act together, get its house in order, clearly. Stomp out COVID, build up infrastructure. President-elect Biden has said that's what he wants to do, and I think clearly that's what we have to get our house in order. And second, we have to work with our allies. Everybody says it, and it's really true. But the main point here, I think, is that we as a country, we do still lead in a significant way. Not as much as we did, but still in a significant way. We have to position ourselves to get China's respect. Otherwise, China will bully. When I was serving in Beijing, I had a very strong impression after about a year there. China will just keep on coming. They'll just keep on coming until they're checked, either internally or externally. And there's not a lot that we can do internally, but there's a lot we can do externally. And if we show to China that they cannot push the United States around, and if we Americans develop a strategic long-term plan toward China, which enables us to, by plugging in the various parts of it, that they can't bully us and push us around, then that's really, I think, the real key here. And lots of the other pieces that tend to fall into place. There'll be difficulties, some successes, some failures, but we have to have a strategic plan that shows that China cannot push us around.
I mean, I do think it's already quite interesting that we're even at the point now in the bilateral relationship where the Chinese are being portrayed as the bully, that we're, you know, as the most powerful country on earth, at least militarily and presently economically, even thinking that we are not the ones pushing other people around. I mean, that to me is also momentous. We'll talk about the ways, I think, shortly that the way that General McMaster just described it, the U.S. can compete with China and how we compete. But before we get there, you know, with the spread of COVID-19, which you've both alluded to, and both the United States and China have recently endured a pretty shaky 12 months, culminating in the insurrection on Capitol Hill last week and a persistent revolt in Hong Kong. Shabani, you have closely covered expanding Chinese power in Hong Kong, including the arrest of protesters and media tycoon Jimmy Lai. Just this morning, the International Republican Institute here in Washington, a U.S. democracy promotion organization, wrote that China's national security law has destroyed Hong Kong's vibrant democracy and anyone who tries to protect it. What are Hong Kong's prospects, Shabani, and will its politics continue to rattle the mainland?
Yeah, I mean, you know, over the past 12 months, things have not been good at all for Hong Kong, as you know. That there was a point, I think, that we were all sitting here last year, seeing a very weakened Beijing because of the pandemic, before things got so out of control everywhere else, and China just claimed that victory as their own, right? And the prevailing narrative is now that China's won, and the West is a total mess. And in those 12 months, I think not just in Hong Kong, but really around the region, Beijing has taken great effort to, basically make incursions on pretty much every border it has. India, for one, definitely moves in the South China Sea, but no more so than Hong Kong. I think that the national security law, when it was first introduced, I think it took even the pessimists by surprise. It took even those who were the most cynical about what Beijing's intentions were in Hong Kong by surprise, just because of how sweeping and how broad it was. In the early months of the national security law being passed last June, we were hearing, oh, it's only going to be used against a very small minority. It's not going to fundamentally affect basic freedoms and basic rights that Hong Kong has enjoyed, for decades. But that has turned out to be largely untrue. And now we're seeing not just a crackdown on political activists, but also civil society leaders. And, those two are very enmeshed here in Hong Kong. We're seeing the beginnings of censorship on the internet, which has been, very shocking, and just this climate of fear, right? I mean, all the things that you used to see on the streets, posters, political art, shops, showing that they supported the pro-democracy movement. A lot of that's gone, and I think the mood here is a very depressed one, really. And I think people don't see that getting any better. In fact, they see it getting much worse quite quickly.
Thanks, Shabani. Senator Baucus, the proliferation of the coronavirus divided China and the United States even further apart from each other. And you have been outspoken about your belief about the power of diplomacy, and certainly the halt of international exchanges between the two countries and the anti-Chinese rhetoric from the Trump administration. It has not helped diplomatic relations. But you've also been accused of being an apologist and for not being willing to hold China accountable during this period. Is it possible to seek accountability with diplomacy? How would you do that here?
Well, we have to do our best. Just have to try. Going back to what Shaban said, it's the haunting conclusion, based on what she and others have said, is that China seems to be proceeding with its national security law in Hong Kong almost with impunity, and that not much has been done about that. And it raises a deeper question, or a point, that not much potentially can be done about that. All the sanctions that we've imposed with respect to human rights violations in Hong Kong, I think, are basically ineffective. They hurt Chinese or Hong Kongers, and maybe even some Americans, more than they hurt China. And in addition, I don't think Xi Jinping cares. I mean, Hong Kong is China's as far as he's concerned. So it's hard to find an accountability that upholds human rights in Hong Kong. The same is somewhat true in Xinjiang. It's a huge challenge we're facing. How in the world do we change China's behavior, pursue more human rights, values that we think are so important in the West? It to me also raises an even deeper question, which is American exceptionalism. How much can we as Americans, with our values and what we view as exceptional, push on or encourage other countries to follow? In this case, an authoritarian one-party country, China. China's different. China's not U.S. Different value systems, and China has its own exceptionalism, at least as Xi Jinping sees it, and as the CCP see it. So it's going to be very hard on human rights, I think, to be honest about it, to change China's behavior. Now, we can in other areas. I think China does want to work with the U.S. China does want to reset with the U.S. China wants normalcy. China, in a certain sense, is a very conservative country. They don't like the boat rock too much, but they want to keep moving, keep going, in their view. Long haul, step at a time, salami slicing. People talk about Weiqi and go. I mean, just slowly. And to hold China accountable, I think the only way is for U.S. to be much stronger internally than we are now, solve COVID, somehow get rid of most of the divisiveness in American politics, build up our infrastructure, education, et cetera, and to show, and then we can project foreign policy much more effectively the stronger we are economically at home. And our allies will see that too. And we can influence and work with our allies better if our allies see that are strong. Right now, our allies see us a bit adrift under the Trump administration. We slapped tariffs on a lot of their products. We bully them. We're not friends. And, you know, it's easy to say, oh, that'll come back now under President Biden. It's going to be difficult. It'll take time. In the last 4 years, China's worked hard to exploit that rift by, as we all know, signing that treaty, the bilateral investment treaty with the Europeans, working with Southeast Asian countries and other countries around the world to try to push to make it more difficult for the U.S. to come back and more difficult for our allies to come back. But bottom line, we just have to show our own strength in the best sense of the term. It's partly military, but it's mostly economic, and it's mostly at home. We got our act together, and we're ready to lead, but lead in a way where we listen. We have to be more humble because the world has changed. We can't tell allies what to do. We got to listen to allies and work better together. It's a whole new paradigm. It's a huge challenge.
Well, let's shift our lens and focus at home for a moment. HR, in the same excerpt of your new book, you note that in Beijing, the forbidden cities seem to reflect, quote, a contrast between the outward confidence and inner apprehension of China. You said that the three great halls at the city center were meant not only to impress, but also to defend from threats that might come from both outside and inside the city's walls, unquote. Looking at the U.S. Capitol right now, it is hard not to recognize some parallels. And before we get to the foreign policy implications of the insurrection and the division inside of the United States right now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff recently released a letter to military personnel reminding all that any acts to disrupt the constitutional process not only violate military values, but also the law. What are your reflections right now about the reports of law enforcement and military personnel's involvement in the attack on the Capitol?
Well, Justin, I think that we have a tremendous capacity for self-flagellation and moral equivalency. And I think that the tone of this conversation has moved in that direction. When you talked about how the U.S. pushes people around, or when Max is suggesting that Chinese people really don't want to say in how they're governed. So I would just take an exception to the I think the prevailing interpretation of the traumas that we've been through over the past year, I think quadruple traumas of a pandemic, a recession associated with a pandemic, the social and racial divisions laid bare by George Floyd's murder and the associated concerns across America about inequality of opportunity or unequal treatment under the law. And now this vitriolic political experience that we've been through in context of a presidential election culminating in the assault on the Capitol, right? These are all, these are all traumas that have stress tested our democratic form of governance and stress tested our institutions. So, I not to be, Pollyannish about it, but I think we ought to take pride in the fact that our institutions have withstood the test. I think we ought to take pride in the fact that more Americans than ever voted in this presidential election, and we are divided politically, right? But if we weren't, it would look kind of like a one-party system, wouldn't it? Which I don't think we really want anyway. So, we do have freedom of the press and freedom of expression. We do have due process of law and rule of law in our country. So I think we should be confident, right? And I think we should do more than what Max is suggesting of managing our decline, right? I think that we have tremendous competitive advantages, especially as Max indicated, when we work with our allies and partners in like-minded countries. And you know what? I think this is pushing on an open door. Our allies and partners haven't gone away. Okay. Look at, for example, the invigoration of the Quad format: India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. Now, this is, I think, due to the fact that we are bound together by common principles, a belief that people should have a say in how they're governed, for example, but also based on the actions of Xi Jinping. You know, I write in Battlegrounds about our tendency towards strategic narcissism, to define the world only in relation to us and to assume that what we do or decide not to do is decisive to the outcome. Well, I think that there's an ingredient of strategic narcissism to this conversation because we aren't acknowledging the degree to which Xi Jinping is driving us together and actually strengthening our alliances. I think we ought to send him a thank you note maybe for it. Look at what's happening to Australia right now. This is an object lesson, right? And Wang Yi can travel all around Southeast Asia, but you know what? They know what Yang Jiechi told them in 2015 at the ASEAN conference. He said, you know, we're a big country and you're little countries. Get used to it. So, you know, again, as I mentioned, the choice really is not between Washington and Beijing. The choice is between sovereignty and servitude, right? And that ought to be our message, I think, to countries in the region and globally.
So yeah, just to jump on that for a second, actually. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of sort of alternate, ways to look at what happened over the past week, right? I mean, even Chinese netizens have been commenting, oh, maybe in our system, Trump would be president forever. But the U.S. is a democracy, and these institutions have held up, and there is a risk in using incidents like this as propaganda, right? It does open a window for people to look at the US, to look at what's happened, and also to see that fundamentally the election was certified, the inauguration will go ahead, and there will be a smooth transition of power, which obviously is something that Chinese people don't have, right? And I think that there's been so much evidence, including in the most recent Pew poll, not just looking at Europe, but also countries in Asia, right? That actually, on the ground, people really don't like what Beijing has been doing in the region and across the world, really. So I do think that populations here, even if not at the elite level, that populations are very, very hungry for U.S. leadership. They're still very I think swayed by American values at the end of the day.
Hey, I just want to. I just want to agree with Max though on a point as well, and the points that's being made overall is we have a lot of work to do, right? And what I write about in the book as well is that we need to turn what others see as our greatest weaknesses into our strengths, right? And we do have a lot of work to do to strengthen our democratic institutions and processes, and so I agree with Max that this is I think this is a competition, obviously, but I think at least fully half of that competition is making ourselves stronger and better.
If I might to just clarify, HR and I go back a little bit. We've been on a panel together. We talk to each other quite a bit. But the main point, I'm not for managing the decline. That's not where I am. I think we need to go forward and do the very, very best that we can and be clear-eyed about it. I think we all agree. And American values make a huge difference, no question. And I was here in Beijing. I'll never forget this one 28-year-old foreign student just came back, actually the UK. And I met her just bumped into her at the airport there in Beijing, got talking. Says, how was it? Oh, I loved it. Why? Oh, openness, freedom. It's just terrific. Gosh, it's just so wonderful over there. When you tell that to your friends, I asked, what do they say? Oh, they're so envious. They're so jealous. They wish they could have gone over. And as you know, we send over about 300,000 Chinese students to America a year, and they all come back with basically the same reactions. It really makes a big, big difference. My concern, frankly, is how quickly we get our act together, our house in order in the United States. There is still deep, deep political division in the U.S. I think President Biden is going to have as decent as he is. I've known Joe for 40 years. He's one of my best friends. He came to my wedding in Montana. But even so, he's going to have a very difficult time working with Republicans and Democrats and all the different groups in the U.S. because I know enough about Washington to know that a lot of senators in D.C. are going to want to throw sand in the gears, are going to want to make it difficult for Biden to succeed. Many of them are running for president in 2024. Some are running for re-election in 2022. politically, it's going to be very, very difficult. We have to do our very best to help him work with groups, military, business, labor, etc., so that we can start to get some agreements, cohesion, and reduce a lot of this divisiveness that still exists in America, so that we can more effectively attack COVID, so that we can really do the things we need to be doing at home. That to me is my biggest concern: how well and the degree to which we can manage that divisiveness. Because I think it's very serious.
And we've had a fantastic panel, actually, the second installment of the Power Lunch. I would refer our viewers to check it out on the Power Lunch website on national unity. Was a fantastic panel on precisely that subject matter. I want to turn our focus, though, to our allies and to others in the East Asian neighborhood. One of the Trump administration's first foreign policy actions in 2017 was to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, a deal that would have been the world's largest trade agreement had it actually been passed, and it would have covered 40% of the global economy. Excluding China, it was viewed as not only a decent economic policy by the Obama administration, but a useful foreign policy tool to reduce the dependency on Chinese trade, which is obviously a major source of Chinese leverage. Senator Baucus, many of the parties to the TPP went on to sign a similar agreement without U.S. involvement about 2 years later.
Right.
And there's talk that the Biden administration would pursue TPP anew. Has the political era of trade liberalization passed, or do you think this is a good idea?
I think it's a very good idea to rejoin, somewhat under Japan's leadership now, but it's going to be difficult. It's going to take a little time. When I was in Beijing, I thought that the most important strategic policy group idea that crossed my desk was TPP. I thought it was so important. I took it upon myself to fly back to Washington 2 months before the election, personally lobby 43 different members of Congress, bipartisan, both houses, on TPP, explain how important it was. We just have to pass TPP to keep our influence in the region. It was toxic. I got nowhere. Why? Because Hillary Clinton deep-sixed it because of labor, and Donald Trump deep-sixed it because he said it cost jobs. But it was a big mistake, and we just have to do what we can to get back. Now, it's going to be difficult. Biden can't just pivot right away. He's going to have to work through it a little bit. And I think if he can find a way, if he shows more to American workers that he feels their pain. Now, some jobs are lost on account of trade, but not all jobs are lost on account of trade. Some of it's technology. But nevertheless, people who lose jobs, people that Trump is appealing to, have to also be appealed to by Joe Biden in a way to show that, hey, we hear you, we feel your pain, we're listening to you. We're here together as Americans, and that will help. Now, meantime, China's pushing RCEP. There's even some vague talk that China might want to join a TPP, reconstituted. I don't know, but it's going to be. We have to and should, in my judgment, find ways to get back and join those agreements, and so we can be more effective. Let me just say at this point, one reason I flew over to D.C. to push for it, a couple ambassadors in the region would say to me, "Now, Max, you got to do TPP. Why?" Answer: because we want to play you off against China. If you do TPP, then we could do a better job playing America off against China. We have to deal with. We're here in the region. We got to deal with China. We also don't want to be controlled by China. So we want you here to help us.
HR, when the U.S. pulled out of TPP, I think it's safe to say that there was a sigh of relief from Beijing. You were in the Trump administration when the decision was made to pull out. Was this a strategic mistake that weakened the U.S. position in your mind?
Well, I'll tell you, Justin, it was just going to happen anyway, as Max said, whether it was a Hillary Clinton administration or a Trump administration. And I think what we have to recognize is, because we're a democracy, our government's going to reflect the will of the American people. And what you're seeing is a broad range of discontent among those who feel like they were left behind during the transitions in the global economy in the 90s, but then especially after China's accession into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And remember when the initial discussions on NAFTA and when Ross Perot was running for president, and he called it the great sucking sound, of jobs going to Mexico. Well, hey, there was a great sucking sound, but it was really jobs going to China instead. And so that discontent, it really cuts across both parties. And so I think multilateral trade agreements in general are a stretch, right? I don't think they're going to happen. Now, what can we do, I think, is what we ought to ask. We can pursue more bilateral agreements, right? I mean, the Japan trade deal, that's immensely important. I think, pursuing trade deals with, with other countries in the region, a lot of that work's ongoing with Vietnam, for example, and then also take elements of the great work that was done under the TPP on issues like data standards, right, and so forth, and try to apply those broadly across the region. So we can get some work done. But I think we're just under a political constraint that affects both parties.
In 2020, my Shar School colleague Ming Wan published a book called The Political Economy of East Asia. And in it, he finds that until now, a good or at least a non-hostile relationship with the United States has been a necessary condition for an East Asian country's economic success. But, Professor Wan writes, U.S.-China tensions puts that post-war pattern in question. It puts it to the test. Shabani, we have seen the power of the Belt and Road Initiative already in countries like Pakistan, Djibouti, Mongolia, Montenegro, Tajikistan, the list goes on, but also in Laos. How do Southeast Asian nations see the temptations of the Belt and Road Initiative, and how much of their decision-making depends on viable development aid from the United States in the future?
It's a really good question and a really interesting topic. I think it depends which Southeast Asian country you're talking. Each one has very different circumstances and different domestic audiences to please or not. In the case of Laos, which obviously is a one-party state. But I think the past year has obviously limited Beijing's ability to continue with a lot of these projects, right? I mean, I think the idea of a cohesive Belt and Road that all falls under this umbrella and that's all sort of infrastructurally beneficial to China has kind of been debunked. I mean, I think the Belt and Road idea has sort of been bandied around a lot and really it's used by Chinese companies quite liberally sometimes to just gain favor with the Communist Party, even though their projects are not really ordered up by Beijing. But I think in the case of a country like Laos, when they've gone way too far down that road, where they're at a point where almost their entire electrical grid is now controlled by China, where they have a massive railway running through the country and dam building, and this is their entire economy. That there's really no way out of it, and there's very limited options. I think for other countries in the region, like Malaysia, famously a few years ago under Mahathir's leadership, kind of rejected these Belt and Road projects and didn't want to be beholden to China. I think over there that there's a little bit more room for some countries to maneuver, right? But even as recently as this week, when Wang Yi was traveling to Myanmar, it's not so much Belt and Road physical infrastructure that Beijing can sell now. It's also communications technology, 5G, LTE networks, Huawei cables, and all of that type of infrastructure as well, right? And the region is very dependent on that. That there's no two ways about it, right? And Beijing's economy is doing quite well now, and they do have the muscle to flex on that front.
Senator Baucus, through the Belt and Road Initiative, China believes that the economic interdependencies that you believe have stabilized the U.S.-Chinese relations can be leveraged to uproot U.S. influence elsewhere. What do you think the Biden administration should do to counter all this?
It's going to be very difficult. Going back to TPP, other agreements, I think are helpful. I do think there's value in multilateral agreements, even though HR tends to suggest maybe not, because if you can't agree in multilaterally, that tends to raise the standards even higher than they would be bilaterally, because when several countries get together, they can, how can I say this? It's politically, it's easier. In a bilateral, the national politics makes it more difficult. Anyway, joint agreements, I think that's very important. the we have to have a very strong foreign policy presence in the countries mentioned here. That's going to be difficult. Some are closer to China than the U.S. It gets back to the allies question in the region, starting with Japan, South Korea, Philippines to a degree, Australia, India, and maybe a bit with Indonesia, but just really strengthen our diplomatic efforts there. I don't know that we have the same resources that we can spend in the Southeast Asian countries and the BRI countries that China has. It's going to be very, very difficult. So much of our leverage is going to have to be on values. It's going to have to be on trust. It's going to have to be to show that we really are capable of working together, allies. And otherwise, it's going to be difficult. But we have to try. We have to do our very best, because it goes a long way just to show to Southeast Asian countries that, hey, we really care. We're here. We want to help with you. Do this together and help you vis-a-vis China. Now, these countries are still going to want to deal with China. Clearly, Australia very much almost depends on China. So we have to find a way to skin that cat where it's a little bit of both. It's not going to be black or white.
HR, North Korea seems to be in a dire position right now. We know that they have been hit hard by COVID. We know that trade has dropped with China 75% just last year, and they've shut down any foreign tourism that they ever had. Kim Jong-un recently made a speech featuring their concessions about the country's current struggles. Does this economic problem and broader social problems change their position in foreign affairs in any way?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it makes the regime more desperate, right? More desperate in its what it is mainly driven by, which is to perpetuate the Kim family dictatorship. Right? We have to remember, hey, this is the only communist hereditary dictatorship in the world, and it has been able to hold on to power through all these control mechanisms associated, with this police state. But then also through an ideology, this Juche ideology, right, which really has made destitution into a virtue, right, or a sign, of almost racial purity for the North Koreans. So, Kim Jong-un is doubling down, on the rhetoric associated with self-reliance and so forth, and the need for them to make sacrifices. And he, as you know, in the speech, he ratcheted back even further economic expectations. And so I think that what you're going to see is a period of repression internally, just to kind of extend the state's control and to prevent any kind of unrest internally. And you're going to see probably some kind of a lashing out externally, right? And if they go back to the old playbook, right? The old playbook is for Pyongyang a provocation, like a nuclear test maybe, or a missile. Firing missiles, and then using that to try to get us to clamor to talk with them, and then demanding a payoff just for the privilege of talking with them, alleviation of sanctions, and maybe just a direct payoff in cash. I hope we don't do that. I think what we really ought to do is continue the strategy of maximum pressure, because, Justin, I think we have to test the thesis, at least, that Kim Jong-un could be convinced that he's safer and the regime is safer without the weapons than they are with them. I think that's really what we're endeavoring to do. And I think that the Biden administration ought to continue that policy. There are ways to improve, I think, implementation of that policy and so forth. But it's tough to predict what's going to happen in the North, right? For so long, many people have predicted the collapse of the regime, right? And it hasn't happened. So, but I do think you're right about this. In that this is maybe an unprecedented period, maybe going back to the famine, the famines of about 20 years ago, right? But it's a desperate situation for the North.
If I might jump in there, I all solutions about North Korea go through China. All roads lead through China. China is going to determine the outcome in North Korea. Don't forget, the peninsula just next door. And China sent millions, troops in the peninsula in the Korean War. They care. And I remember one meeting, a couple of meetings, one with President Obama and President Xi. And it was just very clear to me how much Kim Jong-un was under the skin of President Xi Jinping. It's more emotional. Now that gave me two conclusions. Number one, he really cares about what goes on in the peninsula in Korea. But number two, he's having a little bit a tough time influencing Kim Jong-un. But I believe strongly that China does not want a peninsula that's going to be American controlled. They like the split in a certain sense right now, north and south, because that maintains some kind of, that's not equilibrium, but at least prevents the entire peninsula from being a country that's close to Western sphere of influence rather than China. So and China's, if something happens to Kim Jong-un, there are going to be Chinese troops at the border. I'm guessing you're going to cross over. You're going to find those nukes. They probably know where they are anyway. So the solution in North Korea, very much, in my judgment, has to be tied in with China. In the past, when I was serving over there, I was very disappointed and almost embarrassed how we dealt with North Korea. Top officials would come over, I won't name names, and it was just a checklist. North Korea was just a checklist, asking China to, influence North Korea in a way Americans wanted. No more nukes, no more missiles, and so on and so forth. It was just checking the box. We had no strategic plan how to deal through China over to North Korea. It's embarrassment. And I think my lesson, what I learned from all that is I've already said it twice, I'll say it 3 times. Part of the North Korea solution does depend upon China, how we deal with China and get China's involvement in solving North Korea.
Moving to the southern border of China, Shabani, in September of last year, shots, of course, were fired across the disputed border region of India and China for the first time in 45 years or so. Both, of course, are nuclear armed. Why are they engaging in escalating tensions in this region now? Is there a role for the U.S. here?
Yeah, I think it really did take a lot of people by surprise, that Chinese incursion into the Indian border and sort of tensions between India and China quite routinely flare up, but this one again quite hard to disconnect from COVID and the idea that the rest of the world was pretty distracted, and China has been flexing. It's been sort of flexing everywhere, including on the South China Sea and the Indian border. I think back to basically all the suggestions that we've heard on this panel today is that I think the strengthening of alliances and U.S. alliances around the region, in a much more cohesive and in a much more coherent way, sort of fleshing out some of the Indo-Pacific strategy, of which some of it was, well, all of it, I guess, was leaked recently or declassified. I think the framework for that, including with the Quad agreement, is there. It's just a matter of how to kind of flesh that out and kind of take on Beijing in a way that's much more regional and much more cohesive. And it's something that all of America's partners in the region, including New Delhi, are looking to. I mean, and are really hungry for and really want to see from the Biden administration, including just a return to diplomacy, just folks showing up in the region, attending summits, attending regional, summits, and filling diplomatic positions that have been empty for so long, right? And I think that is the overarching theme of this, right? In terms of is there a role for the U.S.? What can the U.S. do? I think it starts with that, and getting back to the diplomacy.
Hey, just a quick comment on that. I think if we've been talking around, the need for strategy. Well, I mean, the framework, the foundation for the Indo-Pacific strategy was declassified this past week. I would encourage everybody to take a look at it. And what I think you'll have to conclude is, hey, there is a strategy, right? Because I happen to know that there are a number of classified detailed strategies and implementation plans that underpin that, because I was involved in putting these together in that that 13 months that I was in Washington. But of course, as we've been discussing, it's all about implementation, right? And so I think that there is a strategy in place. I think it's been implemented. I mean, I think the government has shifted in this direction. Clearly, the departments and agencies have. Is there room for improvement? Of course there is. Yes, there is. But I think it was good that this strategy got declassified. I mean, it happened, during the maelstrom and this profound disappointments we all felt associated with the assault on the Capitol, and this the tension associated with the president's refusal to support a smooth transition to the Biden administration. But it really is a fundamentally sound strategy. A lot of really good people worked on it, and an important point is, we worked on it collaboratively with allies. And I think it's really important, right? If you want to generate unity of effort and a common understanding, you can't develop a plan. This is the declassified plan here. Right? You can't develop a plan and then bring it around and say, hey, sign up for this, right? This is what we came up with. You have to frame these complex challenges together, right? And to understand, our mutual interests and how we have to work together, to understand what our competitive relative advantages are, right? And how we can gain synergy by working together. So, I think that some of the strongest appointments we've seen to the Biden administration are in the Indo-Pacific area, and I think it's a really strong team coming in. As Max has mentioned, the administration deserves our support, right? And what I really hope, and one of the reasons I wrote the book I wrote is because I think around foreign policy, we should be able to come together, right? Like we are, for respectful civil discussions, right? And so, who's for China successfully exporting its authoritarian mercantilist model to the world? I don't think anybody is, across whatever the political spectrum. So anyway, there is a strategy, and I hope the Biden administration picks up on it, right? Improves it, and implements it more effectively.
HR, could you send me a copy of that, please?
I sure will, Max. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have my email address?
No, but
I can manage.
Thank you. I'd like to see it. Thank you.
Yeah, this is the Shar School. We're a locust, for a nexus of connections here. We're happy to facilitate this exchange of information. So HR, let's take an opportunity then to maybe apply this strategy then to two really good examples, I think, in that Indo-Pacific region. In a 2019 International Security article, my Shar School colleague Ketian Zhang argues that China prefers to use non-military gray zone coercion in the South China Sea when the risk of potential escalation of a conflict with the U.S. is high. For instance, they will use civilian vessels to ram in the way that you were just describing earlier. What should U.S. policies be in response to this kind of gray zone coercion? Or maybe you think that this kind of suboptimal result is actually maybe the best result possible.
No, I think we can compete much more effectively against Chinese aggression that operates below the threshold of what might elicit a direct military response, right? And you mentioned the maritime militias, but they use a broad range, of course, of actions. There have been some. I think one of the best defenses against China's campaign, what I describe in Battlegrounds as of co-option, coercion, and concealment, is investigative journalism, right? And I think Shibani, you and your colleagues have done an amazing job, I think, on countering Chinese aggression just by pulling the curtain back on their activities. John Garneau's study in Australia was groundbreaking. There have been similar studies of Chinese influence efforts, to buy off elites and dominate the narrative and exert influence through economic co-option and coercion. And I think the investigative reporting that was very difficult to get done, but that has exposed the extent of the campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang and the forced labor, and now the economic actions that we're taking, against the entities that are involved in that inside of China. So, yeah, I think that what I think we ought to do is strengthen our democratic institutions, and I'm including obviously the Fourth Estate here, and our processes, and that's the best way. A lot of it's, effective law enforcement or financial actions, and really competent competition, right? It means integrating all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to accomplish objectives that are commonly understood. And I think that that we can compete at this below the threshold of what might elicit a military response. And at the same time, though, we have to deter military conflict as well. The object of this coercion is Taiwan. And I think we all have an interest across the free world at helping deter Chinese Communist Party aggression below the threshold, as well as a potential military assault on Taiwan.
So perhaps one of the conclusions we should be drawing here, by the way, is that the U.S. government should be funding the Washington Post. What headline?
Jeff Bezos
will take care of that.
So staying in the same geographic region, more conflict simulations have focused on Taiwan than maybe any other region of the world. HR relations between Taiwan and mainland China are fraying again. What should the Biden administration's approach be here then? How unconditional should America's commitment be, and what are the contributing factors involved in U.S. decision making here, do you think?
Well, gosh, I invite others to comment on this as well. But I think strategic ambiguity is okay. It's worked so far, right? I don't think we have to go any further, because what we want is the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Communist Party to have doubts about, to at least consider that the United States could respond militarily in a way, and we still have, tremendous military capability in the region. The PLA is getting much better. The People's Liberation Army, I mean, they've engaged in the largest peacetime military buildup in history. They've increased defense spending since the mid 90s, 800%, right? So this is nothing to undervalue, but I think we have tremendous deterrent capabilities in the region, especially when we continue allies and partners. And I think making public the 6 assurances like the State Department did earlier, I think that's fine. I don't think it's necessary to go any further than that. But I would say, Justin, helping Taiwan defend itself, right? Not only just with arms sales, but with advice and expertise, not maybe directly from the United States, is important as well. Taiwan is taking responsibility for its defense. President Tsai Ing-wen has made this a priority. And I think, in old-fashioned terms of Thomas Schelling, right, deterrence by denial, what we need to do is to convince the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA that they cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of force. I would be up for a free trade agreement with Taiwan. I think that would be good to have. But I don't think it's necessary to make explicit commitments to Taiwan's defense. And I don't think it's necessary, to push Taiwan toward independence.
And just to jump in here, actually, it's also been very interesting, sitting here in Hong Kong and also observing the dynamics in Taiwan to see how much, pro-democracy activists in Taiwan and Hong Kong have really aligned themselves with the Trump administration, right? I mean, they really, really do think that the U.S. under President Trump made the most significant moves against Beijing and against the Communist Party and in their interests. And there is so much anxiety here over what the Biden administration can bring, also fueled by disinformation and so on. But these moves in the past couple of weeks, including there was a Reuters story just now about additional sanctions against those who were involved in the arrest of the 53 in Hong Kong, and obviously lifting those self-imposed restrictions on Taiwan have meant a lot, I think, to local populations here. And I think they're really very eager to see what the Biden administration can bring. And I think it's going to be quite hard to undo, some of these moves done in the last few weeks of the Trump administration.
Senator Baucus, did you want to come in as well?
I agree with HR. Strategic ambiguity has worked pretty well, and I think it should be continued. That means U.S. to do what it can to maintain that strategic ambiguity, and I think China will follow suit. It reminds me a little bit, I forgot, with either as Kissinger talking to Zhou Enlai, or it was President Nixon to Mao. When the subject of Taiwan came up, the Chinese answer is, well, let's just put it on the shelf. We'll deal with that later. And I think that's pretty much the course that we should be pursuing right now. Not get too wrapped around the axle either way. Not support independence in Taiwan, but just do what we can to keep the ship straight course and not rock the boat too much.
Okay. Shabani, beyond the suppression of speech and political freedoms in Hong Kong, we are also learning more details, it seems, every week about the surveillance and the oppression of ethnic and religious minorities inside China. Is international concern about human rights violations affecting Chinese foreign relations right now, do you think?
I think, unfortunately, under the Trump administration, human rights was not made a clear priority at all, right? It really did not come up that much in the U.S.-China relationship and tensions. I mean, those very heavily revolved around trade. I think that has sort of allowed Beijing to kind of move ahead on a lot of things, even in places that, for a long time they didn't touch, right? Like in Mongolia with, basically trying to eradicate the Mongolian language there and sort of continue to Mandarinize the population. And so I think that a lot of people were excited about Samantha Power's entry into Biden's new cabinet. I think that there is definitely a hunger to see a very much more human rights driven China policy, right? One that actually takes all these issues with the seriousness they deserve. Obviously, in the outgoing Congress, there was an effort to certify what was happening with the Uyghurs as genocide, and I think that that there is going to be a lot of focus and a lot of attention on that, going forward as well, right? And to see whether more concrete steps can be taken there to sort of call out what's happening, including with other sort of minorities and other Muslim minorities in China.
And in just a few minutes, we're going to pause and take some questions from our audience. But before we do, I also want to just touch on a couple other subjects that are internal to China, but of interest, I think, to American audiences and the American government, of course. Senator Baucus, there's a lot of evidence that the Chinese state is pressuring foreign companies to transfer intellectual property. General McMaster has written about this quite extensively. What do you think the U.S. posture could be to these practices? And maybe more broadly, to the new U.S. ambassador to China coming in, what would be the advice that you would give to this person in this current historical moment, as opposed to when you were serving?
Oh boy, that's a big question. Actually, getting a lot of thought to it. Going back to Siobhan's point, it's going to be difficult for Joe Biden to advance human rights more than advance human rights. It's going to be difficult. To be honest, I like her opinion. I don't know that what can be done. The sanctions that we've imposed, as I said earlier, with respect to Hong Kong human rights violations, have not changed China's behavior, and I don't think that it will. And in Xinjiang, somewhat the same dynamics apply. There's a bit of a difference. Xinjiang is China. Hong Kong is supposed to be not China, but after 2047, I guess will be China. But it's going to be hard. Now, the only way I think to significantly affect Chinese behavior with respect to human rights is if the international community comes together and maybe somehow agrees upon Magnitsky genocide provisions. Don't forget, China's in the Security Council of the UN. But it's just if there's just enough outrage, worldwide outrage, and then finally, I think then something's going to be done about human rights violations in China. But until it gets to that, until it gets to more outrage, I don't know how successful we're really going to be. You asked what the U.S. ambassador should do. Really, it's not just what the U.S. ambassador should do. It's what is the United States policy going to be generally. U.S. ambassador working with the NSC, State Department, and of course the president. And a whole of government policy. So we're all working together. To be honest, when I was serving in Beijing, it was very disjointed. There was not much whole government. It's kind of interesting. The U.S. Embassy, we have 2,300 people working for the U.S. mission in China, half in Beijing, half other parts of the country. And in addition to the State Department in the embassy there are 48, 49, almost 50 separate, different United States departments and agencies, each doing their own thing. And it's hard for me to bring people together to work together in sort of a whole government approach toward China. Now, that was then. This is 6-7 years later, 4 years later. And it just could, and the exigencies are much greater. We're almost a near crisis. So I think we will tell China as a country that, as I've said at the outset, okay, China, here's what we can agree to, here's what we cannot agree to, and here are the consequences if you don't follow up, if you don't agree with this.
All right, and then just a final question then for HR before we break. There are a lot of Chinese companies like TikTok, Huawei, seeking a larger market share in the United States. How do you think they should be viewed in the lens of national security, through the lens of foreign affairs? Should they be banned? Where should the U.S. government be drawing red lines over the next 4 years as these questions continue to arise?
Well, I think it has to be based on the security threat. And we have to recognize right from the beginning that Chinese companies are not like U.S. companies, right? They have to act by law as an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think what you're seeing with TikTok and others are concerns about the Chinese Communist Party's ability to access data. And then to be able to weaponize that data through the application of artificial intelligence related technologies. And I think the question we ought to ask those who are skeptical about banning, this kind of these companies that could result in the compromise of our personal data and its exportation to China is: do you really expect the Chinese Communist Party to treat our citizens better than they treat their own people? Well, of course not. And of course, this is the reason to ban Huawei and other Chinese telecom companies that can control the infrastructure through which our data travels. I think that the U.S. government has done a very good job at reinvigorating CFIUS, at really getting the Security Exchange Commission to force Chinese companies that list on U.S. exchanges and are financed by our pension funds to report transparently. And to deny access to those companies that are involved in giving the People's Liberation Army a technological advantage, over our military. I think just in economic, to think about this from an economic competition, and this is really an important point, and I'd ask others maybe to comment on this as well, is that we're talking a lot about government policy, government strategy. Hey, the competition with the Chinese Communist Party, because the degree to which our economies are intertwined, that competition cuts across the private sector in ways that are unprecedented in connection with the competition with an authoritarian country like China. And so what we need to do, I think, is to take almost a Hippocratic oath right across all of international companies to do business in China or in connection with accepting Chinese investment. And that is kind of like, don't do any harm by, first of all, don't aid and abet the Chinese Communist Party's effort to perfect its technologically enabled Orwellian, police state, right? Second, don't aid and abet the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to gain a differential advantage over us, either in an unfair advantage in the emerging data-driven global economy or militarily. And third, don't compromise the viability of your company and the jobs of your workers for short-term profits, right? And this gets to forced technology transfer, intellectual property transfer, and then the Chinese really using that to then manufacture goods, at artificially low prices, dump them on the international market, and drive us out of business. I mean, this has happened so many times, right? So I think the economic competition of this is paramount. It involves obviously the campaign of industrial espionage as well. And we have to all wake up to the competition, right? And I think we have a lot of leverage. We have a lot of options available to us. And when I say we, I mean the free world, working together to counter various forms of Chinese economic aggression.
All right. Well, with that, we'll take a quick break, 30 seconds, and we'll be right back with questions from you, the viewer.
A world in motion. Our next generation of leaders needs new tools, sharper skills, leadership vision, and policy acumen to succeed in today's environment. a hands-on interdisciplinary education that offers a national and global perspective on the complexities of governance. The Schar School, a vision of excellence that melds theory with practice in the spirit of advancing the public good.
All right, welcome back to the Power Lunch. I'm Justin Guest. Let's bring our panel right back, and we'll take a look at some questions from the audience. The first one comes from Ambassador Rich Kozlerich. So this is a former member of the Schar School faculty, actually, but also a former ambassador in his own right to Azerbaijan and Bosnia and Herzegovina, if I'm not mistaken. He writes that the focus on the Chinese Communist Party raises the question: how different would Chinese behavior be if there was no Communist Party? Which one of you feels like taking that hypothetical?
I'll jump into it.
I feel like this is a seditious question for me, so I can't even address it honestly.
Bonnie, we'll punt to the panel that's based over here. Senator Baucus, do you want to go first?
Well, it's interesting. When I was walking down the streets of Chongqing about 4 or 5 years ago, about 8 o'clock, there was a little cafe. Some guys are sitting around a table. So I just had drinking beer and having some soup. And so I just stopped by and sat down and said, "Hey, what are you guys talking about?" And it was a very interesting conversation. I'll try to be very brief. One fellow worked for a newspaper. Actually, he was in the machine shop, not a reporter. Another was a visitor from Taiwan. Another was a student. Another was an owner of the cafe, and so forth. So my first question was, what are we going to do about Taiwan? And right away, this guy says, "Oh, it's ours." I said, "What do you mean it's yours?" "Well, it's ours." I said, "Well, what, tomorrow, next week, next month? When?" "Oh, about 15 years. It'll be ours in about 15 years. And they all agreed around the table. Then I asked another question. I said, "When I say America, what comes to mind?" And the first guy says, "Oh, freedom, democracy, open spaces, clear skies. It's freedom." And they all agreed around the table. Then I asked another question. I said, "Okay, could democracy work in China?" "Oh, no. We'd collapse. It couldn't work here. Maybe 15 years it will." So my answer to the question is that today democracy would not work at all in China. If CCP were gone, maybe the question isn't about democracy, but it's more if there's maybe 2 or 3 party rule. I guess that's the question. But if it's 2 or 3 party rule, then it's not going to be authoritarian, and Xi Jinping will not be President Xi who he is today. So I think it's an interesting question. It's not going to happen. The party is very much in control. They're infiltrating various different parts of government and also the private sector. Xi's consolidating control. He's got his own people around him now. He controls the military commission. It's an academic question, but it's interesting, but it's not going to happen. CCP will be there for the indefinite future.
Let me just say that any research that involves sitting down and drinking soup or having soup with random people is very near and dear to my heart.
It's fun. I enjoy it very much.
Did you have some thoughts about that?
Is that for me? I'm sorry.
Did you have thoughts about that question, or should we move on?
Well, I mean, I don't think that the rule by the Chinese Communist Party is perpetual and preordained, right? I mean, of course, I'm not a China expert. I should have said this up front. But I do think that, that the Chinese people are not culturally predisposed toward not having a say in how they're governed. And I think that this is one of the reasons why the Chinese Communist Party is obsessed with Taiwan, because Taiwan gives the lie to the conventional wisdom that the Chinese people cannot govern themselves democratically, because it's a successful, thriving democracy and free market economic system. And so I think the policies of the Chinese Communist Party of China would be fundamentally different. And I think, for example, if there was pluralistic government, the minorities whose culture is now being extinguished and who find themselves being re-educated in concentration camps who find themselves in the midst of a campaign of cultural genocide. Uyghur birth rates are down 60%, right? 60%. And so I don't think that would be happening, right? So I think that yes, I think the policies would change, and I think that what Walter said maybe at the beginning as well is, and we all know, I mean, China is not monolithic or homogeneous, right? And even as we're talking about competing with the Chinese Communist Party, we should be looking for more and more opportunities to engage in a positive way with entities and people who fall outside of the party. Now, the problem is the space for that is shrinking and shrinking in Hong Kong and within China as well. But I think we ought to be fighting for the chance for positive interaction. What Max said at the beginning, I think, we need more Chinese students in the United States, right? There's this kind of knee-jerk reaction. Oh, well, there's espionage and everything. Hey, reduce visas. Hey, how about more visas, right? And, I think, for example, if there are Chinese nationals employed by U.S. companies who are subjected to the coercive power of the Chinese Communist Party, they ought to be granted a special benefit parole visa or an H-1B visa and come work in the United States. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do differently that communicate that we're not trying to keep China down, right? That's the Chinese Communist Party narrative, right? Our problems are with the policies of the Chinese Communist Party. And hey, we're all for China realizing the China dream. We're all for China, China's national rejuvenation, right? But not doing it at the expense of its own people in terms of extinguishing their human freedom, and not doing it at our expense.
Let's take a look at the second question come in here. This is from our viewer, Lou, who asks, their values are different, but they still care for their economy. And wouldn't a strategic alliance with Europe and the Americas allow us to have more leverage with their markets and purchase power? And I assume by there, he's referring to the Chinese. I think the question of multilateralism has come up a couple of times in our conversation. HR, do you want to respond to this question?
Yeah, I would just say absolutely yes, and I think that everything we do from an economic perspective has to be multilateral, because what the Chinese Communist Party will do is they'll take a divide and conquer, right? So I just offer market share, for example, to competitors. This is why I think we ought to also take a pledge, right? Across our free and open societies, that when doing business inside of authoritarian regimes, we will adhere to local law, but only do so if that local law does not cut against the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. I think we need kind of a pact along those lines.
Anything to add, Shibani or Senator Baucus?
No, I'm sorry, Shibani.
No, I'm good. I'm good. Go ahead.
Yes, we should work together. President Biden, one of his jobs is to pull in American business into the White House and into the Roosevelt room there, or maybe the cabinet room, whatever. Say, hey, this is a near existential problem here. This is serious, and we got to work together. HR has talked about this 2 or 3 times, but it's not going to be easy. When I was serving, we had certain agreements, and the United States imposed sanctions against certain entities in China because China's maybe it was IP violations. I forgot exactly what it all was. The problem was this: the American companies, the American multinationals, kind of did sweetheart deals with China. China is very good at dividing and conquering. China would go to separate American companies and say, "Hey, I know this is the goal, the strategy, but here's what we'll do for you." And U.S. companies did do sweetheart deals and didn't tell us. Many times, a major multinational CEO would come to Beijing, and not only did not tell me or tell the embassy, they did not want me to know that they were there. Because they were doing their deals. And one time I was talking to not the CEO, but the next in line, the major U.S. multinational, his name I won't mention. I said, now, wait a minute. You're doing these deals. And that is hurting America. It's hurting all of us. Why are you doing that? Oh, because we have to. And I said, well, come on. You've thought a lot about this. What's the alternative here? What alternative can you come up with where we're working together? Oh, I have no idea. Oh, yes, I pushed him really strongly. And he still would not come up with some alternative where we could work together. So American companies, they got their quarterly reports. They basically want to make money. Sure, they care about human values. But let me tell you this. In my experience with American CEOs, they talk a good game, but they don't do a good game. They say they're going to do all this because it's good PR. Now, I don't want to be critical, but practically, they really don't do a lot because they don't want to get politics in the way of their business, because that'll upset some shareholders versus some other shareholders, or some suppliers versus other suppliers. It's very difficult. That's why I said, our president, I'd say, okay, everybody, here's we are. And I'm taking names, and we're watching, and we're in all this together. I don't want to take too much time here, but just a brief point. When I frankly chaired the Senate Finance Committee, we're the committee that wrote the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. We did it. All the other committees just basically followed. And I worked with all major entities, Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable, Labor. I said, okay, everybody's in this together. Everybody got to stay at the table. And if anybody leaves, there's going to be consequences. But there's always a solution. If you don't like something, we'll find some way to do it. But stay at the table, stay at the table, stay at the table. I do that constantly. And that's the only way we're able to get that passed. A new president has to do something similar.
All right. Thanks so much, Senator Baucus. I think we're going to go ahead and close this session. Thank you so much to you, to General McMaster, to Shabani Matani from the Washington Post for joining us for what was really a fascinating and lively session of the Power Lunch. A great way to end this opening series. And let me thank our viewers for joining us each week. It has been truly a pleasure to see you each of these Fridays over the last 13 weeks and 9 Fridays of those 13 weeks. We have a lot of people to thank here at the Schar School. First, let me just thank Dean Mark Rozell for conceiving of the series and supporting its creation. Associate Dean Doug Goldstein as well for supporting it. Jill Deering, and then a variety of other people who helped actually create the series. Augusto Pagliarini, Mason Goad, Tim O'Shea, Billy Trost, Beth Eck Ochowski, Chris Anslian, April Grayson, Julie Hudson, and very much, most of all, our producer who is making all of us look decent here on the air with you each week, Paul Nooney, who we are deeply indebted to, who is not actually a producer in real life. He's a fabulous education professional, but just moonlights as a fantastic producer every Friday for us. And I couldn't be more grateful. So on behalf of all of us here at the Schar School, thank you again for joining us. If you want to view earlier episodes, we hope that the shelf life of these episodes endure long after that they're recorded. They live on the Schar School website at www.schar.gmu.edu/Power Lunch. And you can view those. And because we're talking about the next 4 years in the future, we think that they'll still be very much relevant in the months to come as the Biden administration takes power. So until we see each other again, thanks very much for watching, and have a wonderful day. And
thank you.
To Valentina and to Hugo. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stay well, everybody. Keep the faith. Keep the faith.
Thank you.
We at Montana say, Tapper light. That means keep cool, keep calm. Okay. Okay.